Good afternoon to those joining us right now. We'll begin in about a minute or two just to give everyone enough time to hop on. Welcome, everyone. For those joining, we'll start in 1 minute just to have others hop on the call. Welcome to those joining us. We'll begin shortly. We're just waiting for a few more people to get on. So just to be respectful of everyone's time, we will begin. So welcome to today's program. If this is your first time at our events, we welcome you and hope you do visit our website to be more informed for our upcoming events this semester. My name is Bora and I'm the Assistant Director of Programs and Director of Studies at the Tower Center. A little bit about how today is going to go. I'll introduce our moderator and commentator, and then our moderator will introduce our speaker. After our speaker presents, we'll have a short moderated discussion followed by Q&A. So please enter your questions in the Q&A box so our moderator can check them during the portion of the Q&A. It is my pleasure to introduce our commentator, Stefano Recchia. He is a senior fellow at the Tower Center, professor at SMU, and a John G. Tower Distinguished Chair in International Politics and National Security. Our moderator for this program is Ben Feinstein. He is a sophomore at SMU studying history, international studies, and Russian. He is also on the editorial committee for the Tower Center Dialogue. Ben, I will now turn it over to you.
Hello, thank you so much for that introduction. I am very, very pleased to introduce Chris Jenks today. Chris Jenks is an associate professor of law and teaches criminal law, evidence, and the law of armed conflict. He also serves as a consultant for the Department of Defense Office of the General Counsel, a research fellow at the Program on the Regulation of Emerging Military Technology in Australia, and is a member of the Council for the International Institute of Humanitarian Law in Italy. Prior to joining the SMU faculty, Professor Jenks served for more than 20 years in the U.S. military, first as an infantry officer and later as a judge advocate, and he was detailed to the Human Rights and Refugees section of the Office of the Legal Advisor at the Department of State, and as a special assistant U.S. attorney on both the civil and criminal side of the Department of Justice. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to what you have to say, as I'm sure our audience is too, and I'll turn it over to you, Professor Jenks.
Thank you, and Ben, I'm assuming we're good on, you can hear me just fine, and I think Bora already said we're good on slides, so let's get started. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for everyone who's joining us, both from within SMU and otherwise. Just to briefly orient you to what I'm going to be talking about today, I wanted to remind myself to begin with some thank yous. I want to thank the Tower Center for the opportunity to be a Powell Fellow and what that's enabled me to do, research on this topic. I also want to thank Bora and Ben for setting up today's event, and then Madison George, law student here at SMU, who's worked as my research assistant and really been running down a bunch of archival rabbit holes trying to track down some documents. So today I'm going to talk about foreign, in kind of air quotes, foreign fighters. I'll introduce the topic, or how I became interested in the topic, which was a habeas corpus litigation that began a couple of years ago when I was back in DC. And then I'll transition to kind of the broader point or broader issue that's impacting a number of countries around the world. So the point about the foreign fighters is, I guess it's all a matter of perspective. Really, by foreign, what we're talking about is non-Syrian, non-Iraqi, so individuals who are in some way, shape, or form were playing a role in supporting ISIS, and that are not Syrian or not Iraqi. So you can find any number of charts and any number of figures. I've provided you one, and you can see we're talking about thousands of people from scores of countries. Turkey, given that it borders Syria and Iraq, has been particularly kind of impacted by an influx of people coming into and transiting through. You can see Turkey's claim that we're talking about over 50,000 individuals from over 146 countries. Another way just of kind of depicting, where are we talking about? I mean, some of these probably seem intuitive, perhaps the, neighboring or Middle Eastern countries. Russia, though, leading the way in terms of the foreign fighters. And in the top 5, you see a European country, France. Now at the bottom, and what we're going to talk about a little bit later, is so the top part of that bar graph is going to the fight, going to the conflict in Iraq and Syria. And then the bottom is the number who have returned. And that's a big portion of what I would be interested on people's thoughts on, is what do you do about these individuals, both that have returned or that are still in detention. Just a different way of depicting, the regions. You can see, North America on the low end, relatively speaking, but still talking about hundreds of individuals. Over 800 from the Balkans, and we'll come back to this, but over 5K from Western Europe, and again, former Soviet Union or former Soviet republics leading the way with close to 8,000 or almost 9,000. So what do we mean by fighters? Predominantly men, certainly, but not exclusively. So there most certainly were female ISIS fighters, although the overwhelming majority of individuals fighting for ISIS would classify or identify as male. An important component of this is, but we also have non-fighter wives and children, and figuring out what to do with these individuals, the non-fighter wives and the children, is proving exceedingly vexatious for primarily our European colleagues. So let me take a step and just explain how I became interested or partially involved in some of these kind of matters. And I should note at the outset that my comments today are in my personal capacity and do not reflect the position of the Department of Defense or the United States government. So in the spring of 2017, I was selected to serve as the Special Counsel to the General Counsel at the Department of Defense. So in the finest traditions of the United States, of course, lawyers have lawyers. So I was a lawyer for the head lawyer for the Department of Defense. One of the matters in which I played a role in is this Doe v. Mattis case that I'll briefly describe. I want to stress that my comments about Doe v. Mattis come from open media stories, open source media stories that anyone can pull up, or open source court filings by either the United States government or the American Civil Liberties Union. So nothing that I'm saying here today is, of course, is classified, and nothing relies on privileged or internal deliberative actions. So what is Doe v. Mattis? Doe v. Mattis was the habeas corpus litigation that arose following a dual US-Saudi citizen being detained in northeast Syria by the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF. So the SDF detains this individual. He claims to be an American. The SDF turn him over to US Special Operations Forces in the area. So at this point, you now have the US military having taken custody of someone claiming correctly to be a US citizen. So within a short time, I think a week or two, the Department of Defense publicly announced that it had taken into custody a U.S. citizen suspected of being an ISIS member. That started what became over a year of litigation concerning whether and how to resolve the issue of the detention of this U.S. citizen. One of the first hurdles was when and how this U.S. citizen could be afforded a defense counsel. Not to belabor it, but ultimately the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, served as quite able defense counsel for the individual. In court filings, the individual was identified as John Doe. Media have released the name you see on there, that it was Mr. Al-Sheikh, but the litigation was Doe v. Mattis, referring to former Secretary of Defense James Mattis. So ACLU serving as defense counsel. This case posed a number of very consequential threats to U.S. foreign policy and national security policy. One of which was, and the overarching issue kind of looming over the litigation, was whether or not, what was the source of the U.S. authority to detain an American. And the U.S., frankly, for 20 now years, has been relying on the authorization for use of military force, which is it was a statute passed into law a week after the September 11th attacks, and over the last 2 decades has kind of been interpreted as increasingly expansive. While if you ever look at the words, they of course talk about Al Qaeda and the Taliban and those responsible for the attack. So here we are in 2017, and the U.S. is claiming that it can detain a member of ISIS, which didn't even exist in 2001, as a result of this legislation. So were the litigation to move forward to a merits ruling, there was the potential of a court order finding the U.S. interpretation of its authority unconstitutional. So that was a considerable risk to the United States government should the habeas corpus litigation move forward to a merits ruling. It was a quite interesting process, because what you saw and as was reported in the media was a host of challenges. One option is, of course, that you can return someone back to the United States and prosecute them. That is a lot easier said than done. When he was captured, Mr. Al-Sheikh, according to the media, was in possession of a thumb drive which contained a number of documents purporting to be of ISIS. This document you see on the right purports to be Mr. Al-Sheikh enrollment form in ISIS. Interestingly, when you join ISIS, you have to check one of 3 boxes. You can either be a fighter, you can check a box for suicide bomber, or you can check a box for shock troop. And Mr. Al-Sheikh purportedly checked the box for fighter. So when Mr. Al-Sheikh is detained, there's this thumb drive that he is found with. He has a couple of $1,000s in cash, and very curiously, he has scuba equipment and a scuba certification card. And yes, this is, of course, the middle of the desert near the Syrian-Iraqi border. So you could potentially ship him back to the United States for prosecution, but the chain of custody or the origins of this thumb drive, which I think would have proved the bulk of the evidence against Mr. Al-Sheikh, was a bit dubious, or not certain. So I think if you're the Department of Justice, you have to consider, do you really want to send someone you believe to be a member of ISIS back to the United States for a prosecution that may well not be successful. And then what happens if and when there's an acquittal? Now you've just returned a suspected ISIS member back to the United States. So this habeas corpus litigation really engaged various parts of the U.S. government, the Department of Justice, in terms of was there a viable case to be made against him, the Department of State, Mr. Al-Sheikh as a U.S. citizen. Did he have a right to a passport or at least a travel document? Could Mr. Al-Sheikh, over his objection, be repatriated to, hypothetically, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia? So each of these issues took up several months of kind of court time and back and forth. The last one that you see on the screen, point of capture release, is one that I was particularly interested in and really is the basis of my application for the Powell Fellowship. And that is the idea of, what about under international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict? What about just returning him to where you got him? What about just taking him back? Here's your $4,200. Here's your scuba gear. Here's some food. Here's some water, and we'll just call it a day. So the idea of point of capture release during an ongoing armed conflict. And that was really something that I was interested in as a law of armed conflict scholar, and that I'm working on. But I think there's some broader issues that are applicable to some other countries and to other issues that I think are going to be of more interest to this audience. But that's at least how I became involved or interested and informed in some of these issues going on with captured foreign fighters. So that's all. Again, I'm sorry. So just to close out the Al-Sheikh story. So in the end, the U.S. government, working with the ACLU, managed to broker an arrangement where Mr. Al-Sheikh was transported to Bahrain, which is where his wife and daughter were. So the outcome here, he was not provided a U.S. passport. My SMU law colleague, Jeff Kahn, would say that Mr. Al-Sheikh has a right to a passport. That issue has not been adjudicated. So Mr. Al-Sheikh was transported to Bahrain, again, where his wife and daughter were located. So let's just recap, the rise and fall of, you hear it as ISIS, the Islamic State in Syria. Some people prefer Islamic State in the Levant, to reflect that this was going on really in Syria and portions of Iraq. Still others, and for a while there, the US government did not like either of those terms because they didn't want to dignify this group as being a state and trying to form the caliphate. So they used the term Daesh, which is taken by the group to be very derogatory, so much so that purportedly ISIS or Daesh would cut out the tongue of anyone who used that name. So you can see on the screen, at its height, over a third of Syria and over 40% of Iraq. But as we move forward to December 2017, ISIS was down to less than 5% of its territory. So I guess two points here. One is ISIS has not gone away. It's gone away in the sense of its major consolidated position in Syria and Iraq, but it has not gone away. Instead, arguably, it's even, in a sense, more of a problem for the rest of the world now than maybe it was in the past, because now it is networked in a way similar to Al-Qaeda, and you're seeing the presence of ISIS in Afghanistan, in other parts of the Middle East and in Western Africa. So we have managed to reclaim and assist the Iraqis and the Syrian Defense Force with driving ISIS out of Iraq and Syria, but they are not gone. Dealing with ISIS in those other locations is a different topic for a different day. What I want to kind of now talk about is, so what's the now what or so what? If ISIS was essentially defeated or at least kicked out of Syria and Iraq several years ago. Why are we even talking about this now in 2021? Well, we're talking about it because of those not so foreign fighters. So you have the non-fighter wives and the children. Large numbers of each of those three categories, foreign fighters, non-fighter wives, and children, are currently being detained in both Syria and in Iraq. So in northeast Syria, you have the Syrian Defense Forces who are detaining several thousand non-Syrian foreign fighters. And the Syrian Defense Forces, the SDF, is essentially threatening the rest of the world, primarily Western Europe. Basically, you need to take your people back. You need to take, the French, the Belgian, the German national who showed up here in Syria to fight as a member of ISIS. You need to take them back. And if you don't, we're going to prosecute them. So it's this unfortunate game of almost judicial chicken. And there's a number of concerns you can see on the bottom left of the screen. On the one hand, we seem to have some technology involved in our detention, but as you can see in some of those images, we got a lot of people in some of these rooms. So the detention conditions are perhaps barely adequate, but certainly not great. And then there's the issue about how would trials work. And the idea of the Syrian Defense Force, which is not a state, it is an organized armed group. Now, it's an organized armed group that the United States, Canada, and the West have backed and supported, but it is not a state. And traditionally, prosecutions and judicial actions originate from a state. So there would be a very significant precedent that would be, I think, established if the Syrian Defense Forces are claiming to hold trials and prosecute suspected members of ISIS. I think it would put the West in an awkward position of having to either kind of thumbs up or thumbs down what you think of those prosecutions in terms of due process norms. And once the Syrian Defense Forces, if the West thumbs down and says these don't meet the standards, then what are they going to do about it? And if the West determines they do meet the standards, what precedent is that setting for a next group that maybe is not one that the US and the West back and support, but is also saying, great, I'm super glad that organized armed groups can hold internationally recognized criminal justice proceedings. So there's a really awkward and unfortunate game of almost judicial chicken that is going on between the Syrian Defense Forces and primarily Western Europe. And one of the points is you'll hear me say a couple of times is essentially very few of the countries from which these foreign fighters originate want anything to do with them and the headaches. And the headaches are considerable, as I just described in terms of the Doe v. Mattis litigation. Prosecutions are hard. Everything about either prosecuting or repatriating your citizens who were doing something associated with ISIS in Syria, Iraq, presents a number of challenges. In addition to the fighters, and I think in some ways a far more problematic issue is what about the non-fighter wives and the children? So again, you get different agencies, different non-governmental organizations will cite different numbers. It is clear there are several camps there are displaced persons camps that are in northeast Syria. You see on the right of the slide, the map there, where hundreds and hundreds of women and over 1,500 children are in these displaced persons camps. These camps are not good. On average, several people are dying a week in these camps. The children are they're malnourished. So the camps you can see what the camps kind of look like in the bottom left photo. So again, these are nationals from around the world, and the women and children who are nationals from around the world that are in these displaced persons camps in northeast Syria that are being essentially run by a combination of the Syrian Defense Forces and by UN aid agencies. And the question is, how long is this going to go on, and how does this cycle end? In Iraq, there are both foreign fighters and wives who are being jailed. Iraq has taken I guess the most polite term would be a robust or aggressive approach towards prosecuting both suspected members of ISIS, but also prosecuting the wives. So I'm not talking about women that went to fight with ISIS. I'm talking about the jihadi brides who clearly were married to an ISIS member, but that's all that they did. Iraq is prosecuting those women for essentially support to ISIS in the form of the marriage. New York Times ran a story describing, and National Public Radio has also done some work here. Iraqi due process does not, and that's why it's in quotes. There has not been not one of these proceedings has lasted more than 15 minutes. The wives in particular are almost always found guilty, and the sentence range tends to be either life imprisonment or the death penalty, again, with a 15-minute process. And again, these are non-Iraqis. Some of them are from France, other parts of Europe, from Central Asia, that are being detained and prosecuted in Iraq. So now let's talk about the responses, such as they are to this situation, in the aftermath of at least ISIS in Syria and Iraq. Let's talk about the responses to, when you've got your nationals that had been basically captured as fighters, or you've got women who are your nationals who were there as wives, and or you've got little kids who are your nationals and were just there as the 2-year-old that they are. So I think perhaps to the surprise of many, and you really don't hear this discussed an awful lot, the U.S. has really done the best job of any Western country that had a significant number of individuals go to fight with ISIS or support them or marry ISIS fighters. The U.S. has done, I think, by far the best job of at least actively dealing and engaging with the issue. So much so that, last October, the Department of Justice announced that there are no known Americans still being held by the SDF. They've all been repatriated to the US. So, what does that look like? Well, again, bringing you back to the US can be a number of things. A number of individuals were repatriated to the US to face prosecution predominantly for providing material support to terrorism. I would draw your attention to the woman you see at the bottom left of the chart, Miss El Hassani, and you'll note the reference to her having 4 children. So she has pled guilty and is currently in jail, having been convicted of material support to terrorism, and her 4 children were essentially turned over to, I believe it's Illinois, Child Welfare Services. So not a great outcome, but there are no great outcomes here. But she is back in the US, the children are back in the United States, and at least they are safe and able to get food, medical care, and all the things that you would expect. So the US has been active in dealing with this radicalization, this problem of its citizens either traveling to the Middle East to either fight for ISIS or provide some form of support, whether it's marriage or otherwise. Additionally, you may have seen just in the last, I think, week or two, it was announced that next January will be is scheduled anyway to be the trial up in Alexandria, Virginia, in the Eastern District of Virginia, of two members of the Beatles, which is the perhaps inappropriate reference to a group of UK nationals from Liverpool who went and joined ISIS and ended up leading a beheading cell, and who are responsible for torturing a number of individuals as well as murder. And you can see that I'm not exactly sure how many of the deaths they're being charged with, but at a minimum, 7 Americans, 2 British aid workers, the 2 Japanese tourists, and a number of Syrian soldiers. In terms of Europe, I think that unfortunately best encapsulates the European response, which is stick our head in the sands and hope that the problem goes away. But as I said, arguably ISIS was defeated, at least in terms of its positions in Syria and Iraq, almost 4 years ago. Europe and other parts of the world, but I want to focus on Europe. Europe has had its nationals, whether they were serving as fighters, whether they were wives, or the very unfortunate children caught up in this, has had its nationals in detention or facing less than adequate prosecution for several years now. And Europe is not particularly interested in resolving, does not appear anyway particularly interested. So I know some of the numbers on this chart are maybe a little bit difficult. So this just gives you an idea of, on the left, you see, it's somewhat staggering, but we're talking about 46 French children. And I don't mean children as in a 17-year-old who I'm calling a child because they're not 18. I'm talking about 46 French children, toddlers, little people that are currently in detention in either Syria by the SDF or the Iraqis. And again, I don't even think you can fairly call the conditions marginal. They are they're not adequate. Certainly not for the needs of children. On the right, you get a sense of why I use the ostrich, and that is you can see the repatriations. So the stick figure is for women. These are wives, non-fighter wives that have been repatriated. And then the stroller represents the number of children. So when you compare the chart on the left to the chart on the right, you can see there's a very significant delta. A handful of children have been repatriated to their European countries of origin. But in terms of the wives, really it's one or two, one to Belgium, one to Germany. So give me a second. I think and I want to just highlight, one particularly, I think, unfortunate approach that's ongoing, which is the United Kingdom. First, I would just loop back to the Beatles. You'll note that among others that were killed, these 2 individuals killed 2 British aid workers, allegedly killed 2 British aid workers. The United Kingdom affirmatively declined to prosecute them. So for whatever reason, the Home Office, the British government affirmatively declined and did not voice objection to the U.S. Prosecuting them in U.S. court. So we obviously have the 7 American victims, but the British had victims as well. But Britain was not. This was not an argument over who was going to take jurisdiction, I guess, to put it mildly. Let's Miss Begum, Shamima. So British born, she left England at 15 to join ISIS, while 15, so underage. She marries a Dutch-born ISIS fighter, travels to Syria. She has a total of 3 children. all three of whom died. The third child died when she was in the camp in which she is currently, she remains detained. It's unclear whether which category she falls under. It's unclear whether she is ISIS bride who had 3 children, full stop, or if she's ISIS bride who had 3 children, but also played a enforcer or other role for ISIS. So again, unclear whether she is just a wife or a fighter or some amalgamation of both. So in 2019, the United Kingdom stripped her of her UK citizenship, arguably rendering her stateless. So she's in detention in northeast Syria. She has been deprived of, she's been told by the United Kingdom that she is no longer considered a UK citizen. So she challenges that citizenship removal process. What happened last week, or I'm sorry, what happened about 2 weeks ago was the UK Supreme Court issued what really seems to me to be almost a catch-22 like ruling. The Supreme Court acknowledged that she could not effectively participate in a hearing to challenge her citizenship removal, that she could not do that while in this detention facility, this displaced person or detention facility camp in Syria, that she would have to challenge it in person in the United Kingdom, that she could not do that, and that she could not do that so long as she had been considered stateless. And essentially the UK Supreme Court said, yeah, so that's where we're at. You can only challenge this in person, but the steps that have been taken already preclude you from ever appearing here in person. So it's not clear how she would ever technically be able to get out of the camp as a stateless person, to be able to get back to England to challenge the determination that she was not entitled to citizenship. So just a couple of thoughts to conclude, and then want to turn it over, and I'm sure we have a number of questions and comments. And the thing I love about the Tower Center and the people, the members and the people that participate is I'm quite sure there's a number of people with considerably, well, varied and more experience on a number of these issues, or greater experience than I do. So I'm look forward to your questions and comments. So just in conclusion, this isn't going away, this issue about radicalization. And if anything, social media is going to continue to play its role, good, bad, and otherwise. It was what I'm kind of referring as the great enabler. I mean, people are able to communicate, disseminate propaganda, and influence people through social media in ways that just weren't the case even, say, 10 years ago. I think we have to recognize this is really hard. There are no good, certainly no easy, good options here. But if we are to be a democratic society, I think states need the will and the capability to both prosecute offenders, and again, that can be hard, as well as repatriate and reintegrate. I think what is going on right now, where foreign nationals or non-Syrian, non-Iraqi nationals are either being left in subadequate detention facilities or displaced persons camps, or being subject to prosecution which does not meet international due process norms, that is only going to cause, that's only going to cause more problems in the future. So for those states that are just trying to head in the sand and get through this, not only is it not going to get through it, you're only going to exacerbate and create more serious problems down the road. So with that, I don't know if it's to Stefano or to Ben, but I look forward to questions and comments.
All right, thank you, Chris. If it's all right, Ben, is it my turn, right?
I don't really mind either
okay,
way.
yeah. So Bora asked me to briefly comment on Chris's presentation, or start off kick off our discussion. My name is Steph Recchia. So I teach international relations here. So I'm a political scientist. I'm a little out of my comfort zone here, commenting on this very interesting legal presentation. So I'll just raise a couple of issues, and then we can open it up. And as I'm sure that many of you in the audience today are probably have probably more expertise on this than I do. So I really enjoyed the presentation, Chris. Thanks. So the first question that I had, just from a research perspective, if you could just briefly summarize for us what exactly were the goals of this project that you set for yourself? Was it primarily basically to provide a more accurate description of this thorny issue that you identify and highlight some of the policy problems, or was it did you have more of an analytical and theoretical purpose, and if so, could you just clarify that again for us? Then on the substance of your presentation, really just two issues. When you started off your presentation, the first question that I was asking myself, especially when you were discussing that first controversial case, what was it, the Mattis versus, I forget the person's name. So, you know, why is this not simply being shifted to a US civilian criminal court? And I think you mentioned, well, because there wasn't, the people at DOD didn't have sufficient confidence that there wouldn't be a viable criminal case to be made in a civilian court. And I was wondering, well, is that seems to be in a sense quite problematic, because it seems applying a highly political standard to a legal case, right? If you decide to send somebody over to a civilian court only if you have a slam dunk criminal case to be made, isn't that in itself highly problematic? And conversely, does that mean that all the other 20 individuals that you or so that you showed were actually prosecuted in US civilian courts, were those sent to those courts because DOD was highly confident that they would be convicted in the first place? And the second comment or slash question that I had, you know, if we, and of course, as you mentioned, the European countries have to deal with very significant numbers, like almost 500 of these in the case of France. So the foreign fighters are in the thousands. And if we take the domestic fighters in Syria and Iraq that have had an operational role in ISIS, we probably are talking of tens of thousands of individuals. So it seems to me that looking at this only through a criminal prosecution perspective is probably unviable, right? You can't lock up tens of thousands of individuals indefinitely. And so I was wondering whether in your experience there has been any talk either in the US government or in the alliance of dealing with this through more of a kind of a truth and reconciliation commission approach within those countries, to say, hey, you know, it's more about re-education and gradually reintegrating these people within societies, because otherwise we risk being left with a kind of Guantanamo problem magnified like manifold. Right? So those were my comments, and thanks again for a very stimulating presentation.
So in terms of the you know, what I set out to do in this research, again, my focus was pretty exclusively on the one option that, again, just referring to open source media reports, the one option that was being considered in the case in which I played a very peripheral role, and that was, is it compatible with international humanitarian law during a non-international armed conflict to take a non-Syrian national and release them where they were captured in Syria during that armed conflict? So there is one article of additional protocol 2 to the 1949 Geneva Conventions that is particularly on point. But, you know, as international humanitarian law often does, it doesn't provide a lot of specificity. It says you have to release people under safe conditions, and they have to be provided food and water. So there was that just sparked an awful lot of thought. Like, so how, I mean, how safe is safe? Safe for how long? You know, what are the risk factors? Was this a viable? Was this viable? Whatever you think of it, politically or ethically, legally under international humanitarian law. So we really wanted, so one of the things I did as part of the fellowship and with Madison's help was going into the archives, working with the International Committee of the Red Cross, and really trying to get as much specificity from the negotiating conference of Additional Protocol 2 as to what states were thinking when they negotiated the contents of Article 5 of Additional Protocol 2. So that's going to be the subject of some scholarship that I hope I hope to publish. It's very micro focused on the negotiating conference, which I'm sure would have been tremendously interesting to all, but I just decided to maybe expand the aperture of this presentation. Your point about the efficacy of using whether or not you're going to get a conviction as a litmus test is, I mean, I don't disagree. I would tell you what my role in this case kind of taught or reminded me of is Mr. Al-Sheikh was in essence a DOD problem. He was a DOD problem because he was a US citizen in DOD custody. I think perhaps that DOD didn't necessarily think through, when you have a problem, we shouldn't be surprised when, if I have a problem, Ben may well want nothing to do with my problem. I would like nothing more than to take my problem as a ball, toss it to Ben, and now say, Ben, it's your problem. You gotta handle it from here. And so I call this kind of like the hot potato kind of situation where Mr. Al-Sheikh was a hot potato in DOD's hands. And the other parts of the US government, no one is really excited about taking over the hot potato. So if I'm at the Department of Justice, I only want to take this very politically sensitive issue. I don't want this to come back and embarrass my part of the organization. So I'm only going to take your hot potato, DOD, if I have a slam dunk. I don't want to be accused of, oh my gosh, DOD messed up this case. He was acquitted, and now we just have a suspected ISIS member walking out into Alexandria, Virginia. Same thing, frankly, with the Department of State. They're the entity that is responsible for consular services and providing passports. I don't imagine that there was a line of consular employees of the State Department who were super excited about the potential of having their name on passport paperwork of a suspected ISIS member. So I agree with you that that was, in a sense, either a political or a policy decision. I would say that in my experience, with all due respect to the Department of Justice, with which I've worked with, they have a very their threshold for taking cases is relatively high. I mean, they tend to take cases, in my experience, where they have a very strong, overwhelming chance of a guilty verdict, or frankly of securing a guilty plea given their track record. It's a very interesting question on the idea of a truth and reconciliation for those individuals, because the U.S. recently announced 27 individuals repatriated, only 10 of whom were being prosecuted. So what's going on with the other 17? I think 4 of them are the kids, but that even there, we're still talking about double digits of individuals who in some way, shape, or form were caught up, involved with ISIS, but not to the point where there could be a prosecution. I think it's safe to say they were disaffected enough to have gone to Syria, Iraq in the first place. And what, if any, measures are being taken to reintegrate them into Detroit society or whatever? I'm not aware of any, nor am I aware of any real efforts in Europe to resolve this. If anything, your Guantanamo reference is probably particularly apt. If anything, one or more European countries, somewhat similar to the US, one or more European countries are attempting to pass laws restricting the ability to return these individuals to Europe, which is in some way analogous to the U.S. Congress having passed a resolution that's been signed into law that restricts those detained at Guantanamo from entering the United States.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that answer. I think my biggest question is that, ISIS is it is a new threat in the sense that, it's a novel organization, but, the U.S. has been involved in the Middle East in a significant military fashion since 2001 with the invasion of Afghanistan and then 2003 in Iraq. And, both of those produced prolonged occupations. And I'm wondering if there is any precedent for how to deal with the situation that emerged from the war on terror. Specifically, we mentioned, Guantanamo Bay in the last question, but, these multinational coalitions going to war in foreign countries. And I'm wondering if there's any history at all there of, foreign fighters having to deal with it, any systems of justice or trial that were established. And, I'm wondering if your research brought you into contact with that at all.
Well, I mean, the kind of as an offshoot or as a part of, frankly, a different research process, it's this issue about coalitions and the good and bad that comes from coalition warfare. One of the things, if you go back, if you look at World War II, that was a big coalition, but it was a different kind of coalition. Meaning, the U.S. fought, for example, with the United Kingdom. But there would be a U.S. zone or sector and a UK zone, and basically each of those countries handled everything and anything that happened in their zone, including prosecutions. Now what you see is a much more integrated. If you look at the air war against ISIS, you could have Danish officers with an Italian officer and French planes and an American or a British commander. So you see this real multicultural at a much more integrated lower level for coalition warfare, but that comes with a lot of challenges. One of the things is civilian casualties. So there was, I think, these offsetting pressures against countries around the world to, on the one hand, you need to be doing something to fight ISIS. On the other hand, you shouldn't be killing or injuring civilians. But ISIS was in control of Mosul, where I serve. Mosul is a very urban area. It is a city of 2 million people. I would tell you it is basically impossible to conduct war in and around a city of 2 million people and tragically and not kill or wound civilians. So one of the things that's come out of this coalition is this it's actually decreased, I think, transparency, because now you don't know who has done what. In terms of who were the pilots from which aircraft. And so one of the issues that's come up over the last 10, 20 years is civilian casualties and transparency as a result of these offsetting tensions of both do something against ISIS, but I don't want to be responsible for civilian casualties, which again are unavoidable given where ISIS was operating, at least at times in the urban area. I think it's important to remember we're in the most prolonged period of armed conflict in the United States history by a wide margin. 2 years ago, we had a United States Marine killed in Afghanistan who was born after September 11th. So there isn't a precedent for what we're doing. It'll be interesting. I don't know, some of you would have seen that President Biden has announced he's both reforming U.S. drone policy and is looking to either repeal, augment, replace the 2001 authorization for the use of military force. So again, it is interesting, to put it politely, that some 20 years later, the U.S. military has been operating at various parts around the world pursuant to a resolution that on its face seems very focused on Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and the September 11th attacks, which makes sense given that it was passed on September 18th, 2001.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm going to just start from the top in terms of audience questions. I think we have until 1 p.m., so we'll see how many we get through. Tatiana Andrusov asks, would it be interesting to know if we have used the services of American imams who can change the ideas of these fighters by showing them that the Quran does not condone what they do? This is especially interesting in the light that religious leaders from the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are working on the misinterpretation to text to show, religious leaders from the Abrahamic traditions are working on reinterpretation of text to show that the holy books of all three point to peace. So I think the question is essentially regarding, are there any religious or cultural efforts to convince these fighters that what they're doing isn't, right?
I mean, I need to disclose at the outset, there's a number of offshoots of this research for which I bring almost nothing to the table. And this is probably part of those. I'm not aware, at least in terms of the US, I'm not aware. The US does not have much by way that I'm aware of disarmament, reintegration kind of services. It's just not something that we've ever done. That's normally left to non-governmental organizations. Other countries have put some expertise in it. I know there's been some limited efforts when transfer and release of individuals at Guantanamo. I know there's been some limited efforts at incorporating Islamic religious figures in the thought that an oath or swearing to the Islamic religious figure that you would abide by the transfer conditions or the release conditions may have more success that way. But that's the only example that I'm aware of, is incorporating some Islamic religious figures in transfer and release process down at Guantanamo.
Awesome. Thank you so much. A very brief question, and granted some of this may not be open to the public, but is there substantial collaboration among intelligence agencies in the US and Europe as to how to deal with this issue?
On how to, as a general matter, there's tremendous intelligence cooperation between the United States and Europe. On this matter, I think, I can tell you that the Department of Justice, when they issued a press release, in essence, on October 1st, announcing, hey, we've got all our Americans back. You can pull it up. At the top of the press release, the Department of Justice called on other countries to basically do their part. And that Europe wasn't specifically singled out, but that was really directed at Europe. So I think from the US perspective, there's nothing to cooperate on. It's European countries, take your people back, figure it out, prosecute them, reintegrate them, get the women and the kids out of these camps. This problem isn't going away. It's only going to get worse. So I think that's the US approach. It is articulated much more diplomatically, of course, than that. But you even see references to, the US position is countries around the world contributed these foreign fighters, these wives, and in a way, these kids. So countries around the world need to step up and take ownership of their nationals.
Awesome. To kind of close it off, this is two questions kind of rolled into one. One, would the case be significantly different if the suspected, fighter was a dual citizen, i.e. a Saudi as well as a US citizen, versus a US citizen only? And then I guess the second part of this is, I guess this is already answered. So yeah, the first one, does the case differ substantially if it's a, say US Saudi or US Iraqi citizen versus just a US citizen in terms of how we handle it?
Well, in the US anyway, the key is, things change so immensely if a US citizen is involved. So if there's really no difference, if you tell me it's a US citizen or it's a US, as was the case with Mr. Al-Sheikh, a US Saudi citizen, that's really no different, because in both of those examples, you're dealing with a US citizen who's entitled to full constitutional protections, due process rights. If you tell me Mr. Al-Sheikh was just a Saudi citizen, then I would tell you that's going to play out considerably different. A Saudi citizen, I don't believe a Saudi citizen detained by Americans in the American military in Iraq or Syria has any habeas corpus. Would be challenging to, I think, articulate the habeas corpus right. So it's the US citizenship that really poses, well, it entitles, our citizens are entitled to the full panoply of constitutional rights and protections.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. It was a true pleasure to have you here. I'm going to pass it back to Bora now to close us out.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ben. And thank you so much, Chris and Stefano. Chris, great presentation. We do value here at the Tower Center. So thank you. And thank you so much for everyone who's attended today, and wish y'all a great afternoon and see y'all next week for our programs.
Thank you all.
Thank you.